Picture a throne room bathed in golden light. The walls rise impossibly high, covered in silk tapestries that cost more than entire villages. Chandeliers drip with crystals, each one worth a lifetime of labor. The air smells of perfume and power, of incense and intrigue. At the center of it all sits a figure draped in velvet and ermine, crowned in jewels that could ransom kingdoms. Courtiers bow so low, their foreheads nearly touch marble floors. Every movement is choreographed, every word is measured, every gesture carries the weight of divine authority. This is what we imagine when we think of monarchy. This is the image burned into our minds by paintings, by textbooks, by centuries of carefully crafted mythology. The king raises his scepter and armies march. The queen speaks and laws are written. Power flows from the throne like light from the sun, absolute and unquestioned. We've been taught to see these figures as the architects of history, the ones who shaped nations and decided the fates of millions. But what if everything we've been shown is nothing more than theatre? Walk closer to that throne. Look past the gold leaf and the ceremony. Notice how the monarch's eyes flicker to the side before speaking, seeking approval from someone standing in the shadows. Watch how certain advisors whisper words that emerge moments later as royal proclamations. Observe the subtle choreography of it all, the way power moves through invisible channels while everyone stares at the glittering distraction on the throne. The crown sits heavy on the head that wears it, but what if the person wearing it never held any real power at all? History loves its grand narratives. We celebrate the great monarchs, the decisive rulers, the iron-willed sovereigns who bent the world to their vision. We memorize their names, study their reigns, debate their legacies. But histories are written by victors, and more importantly, they're written by those who control the narrative. The official records, the state-sanctioned portraits, the monuments and memorials, all of them tell the same story: the monarch was in charge. Yet if you dig deeper, if you read between the lines of official documents, if you study the private letters that were never meant for public eyes, a different picture emerges. Kings who couldn't make a single decision without consulting their councils. Queens whose every public appearance was scripted by handlers. Emperors who signed documents they never read, endorsing policies they didn't understand, playing their part in a production they didn't direct. The elaborate ceremonies, the bowing subjects, the golden throne rooms, they were all props in an elaborate illusion. The real decisions were made in private chambers behind closed doors by people whose names rarely appear in textbooks. These hidden architects understood something fundamental: true power doesn't need to be seen. In fact, it works better when it remains invisible. Think about every royal portrait you've ever seen. The monarch stares out with confidence, surrounded by symbols of authority, but portraits are propaganda. They show us what we're meant to believe, not what actually was. The painter captures the costume, not the truth. The gold frame holds an image, not reality. This isn't about one kingdom or one era. This is about a pattern that repeats across centuries and continents, a system that survived precisely because it remained hidden. While everyone watched the throne, the real game was being played somewhere else entirely. The puppets performed brilliantly, never breaking character, maintaining the illusion so perfectly that even now, centuries later, we still believe it. So if kings and queens weren't truly in control, who was? They moved through palace corridors like smoke. No portraits were commissioned of their faces, no statues erected in their honor. History books barely whisper their names if they mention them at all. Yet these figures shaped empires, toppled dynasties, and rewrote the fate of nations with a subtlety that kings could never master. They had no crowns, no thrones, no official titles, yet they held more power than any king or queen in history. Consider the trusted advisor, the one who stood always at the monarch's elbow. In public, he appeared deferential, bowing and scraping like everyone else. But in private, behind closed doors where no courtiers could hear, his voice became the only voice that mattered. He controlled what information reached the throne. He framed every decision as a choice between two carefully selected options, both of which served his interests. The king believed he was deciding, never realizing he was simply choosing between two versions of someone else's will. Or think about the queen consort, married into power but never meant to wield it. She learned quickly that the bedchamber was the real throne room. While diplomats negotiated in marble halls, she whispered into her husband's ear in the dark hours before dawn. Pillow talk shaped foreign policy. Bedroom conversations started wars. The king woke each morning believing the ideas in his head were his own, never understanding they'd been planted there by someone who understood him better than he understood himself. Then there were the religious figures, the confessors and spiritual advisors who held dominion over the monarch's immortal soul. They couldn't command armies or sign treaties, but they could threaten eternal damnation. They turned faith into leverage, conscience into currency. A king might ignore his counsel, dismiss his advisors, even defy his own family, but very few could resist the man who stood between them and salvation. These holy manipulators learned to frame their political desires as divine will, making every act of control seem like spiritual guidance. Some invisible architects wore even stranger masks. The illegitimate children, born from royal indiscretion, who society forced into shadows but who possessed royal blood and dangerous knowledge. The spy masters who controlled networks of informants and made themselves indispensable by knowing everyone's secrets. The mistresses who understood that influence wielded in private often proved more powerful than authority exercised in public. The childhood friends who grew up alongside princes and knew exactly which emotional strings to pull. What made these figures truly dangerous was their intelligence. They had to be smarter than the monarchs they controlled, clever enough to manipulate without being detected, patient enough to play games that lasted decades. They were political savants, psychological masters, strategists who thought in generations rather than years. While kings were trained to appear powerful, these architects were trained in the actual mechanics of power, how to acquire it, how to use it, how to keep it hidden. History's greatest decisions often bear the names of monarchs who never made them. Wars that kings declared were actually campaigns orchestrated by advisors settling personal vendettas. Treaties that queens signed were agreements negotiated by handlers pursuing their own agendas. Executions that emperors ordered were murders arranged by those who needed rivals eliminated. The crowned heads took credit and blame in equal measure, never revealing that they were merely the public face of private machinations. These invisible architects understood something the visible monarchs never grasped. True power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need golden thrones or jeweled crowns. It doesn't require public recognition or historical glory. True power is content to remain unseen, to work through proxies, to achieve its aims while someone else takes the spotlight. The system worked because everyone was looking in the wrong direction. While crowds gathered to watch coronations and royal processions, while artists painted official portraits and historians recorded official versions, the real architects operated in spaces between the lines, in margins of documents, in conversations that left no record. But who were these invisible architects, and how did they seize control without anyone noticing? Every royal portrait hides a secret. Every crown ceremony masks a lie. Understanding how monarchs became puppets requires understanding how power actually flows through a palace. It is not about individual villains or isolated conspiracies. It is about systems designed to concentrate authority in one person, which paradoxically made that person the easiest to control. Start with information. A king cannot rule a kingdom he cannot see. He depends entirely on others to tell him what is happening beyond palace walls. Reports from generals about wars, accounts from tax collectors about revenue, intelligence from spies about threats. Every piece of information passes through multiple hands before reaching the throne. Each handler along that chain can filter, edit, or completely fabricate what the monarch hears. Control the information and you control the decision. The king believes he is ruling based on facts, never knowing the facts themselves have been carefully curated to produce a predetermined outcome. Royal isolation made this manipulation even easier. Monarchs lived in gilded cages surrounded by elaborate protocol that separated them from ordinary reality. They couldn't simply walk through their cities unannounced or have casual conversations with common subjects. Every interaction was formal, staged, controlled. This isolation meant monarchs developed their understanding of the world entirely through the lens of their handlers. A king who never leaves his palace cannot verify whether his advisors are telling the truth. He must simply trust, and trust is the currency of manipulation. Then consider succession, the moment when power supposedly transfers from one monarch to the next. These transitions created chaos, and chaos creates opportunity. When a king died, his heir was often young, inexperienced, overwhelmed. The invisible architects positioned themselves as guides, as steady hands in turbulent times. A teenage monarch suddenly thrust onto the throne doesn't refuse help from the advisor who has been managing the kingdom for decades. And once that advisor's influence is established, it rarely diminishes. Many regents who ruled temporarily for young kings simply never relinquished control, even after their charge came of age. The machinery of royal propaganda worked tirelessly to obscure these realities. Official court historians were paid positions, not objective observers. Their job was to make the monarchy look powerful, decisive, divinely ordained. They wrote what they were told to write, emphasizing royal brilliance while conveniently forgetting to mention who actually made the decisions. These official histories became the foundation of what future generations believed. Visual propaganda proved even more powerful. Royal portraits showed monarchs as they wished to be seen: strong, confident, commanding. Artists who painted unflattering truths didn't receive commissions for long. The same applied to statues, tapestries, coins, and every other medium that carried the royal image. Citizens who had never seen their king in person formed their impression entirely from these manufactured representations. The gap between image and reality could be enormous, but no one outside the palace walls knew. Pageantry served the same purpose. Coronations, royal weddings, state funerals. These spectacular ceremonies reinforced the idea of royal power through sheer sensory overwhelming. The costumes, the music, the ritual, the scale of it all made monarchy seem inevitable, natural, unquestionable. While everyone watched the ceremony, no one questioned whether the person being crowned actually held any real authority. The genius of this system was its self-reinforcing nature. The more elaborate the illusion, the harder it became to see through. The more people believed in royal power, the less they looked for evidence of manipulation. The invisible architects understood that the best place to hide is directly behind something everyone is staring at. Monarchies were designed to place supreme power in one person's hands, but that design contained a fatal flaw. Concentrating power in a single point made that point vulnerable. Control one person and you controlled everything. The system meant to create strong rulers instead created perfect targets for manipulation. Now that we understand how royal deception worked, it is time to meet the real rulers, the ones history tried to erase. Picture a throne room in 17th century France. King Louis XIII sits rigid in his chair, barely 20 years old, his face pale beneath the weight of a crown he never asked to wear. Behind him stands Cardinal Richelieu, dressed in scarlet robes that seem to absorb the light. The cardinal's hand rests on the throne's gilded back, his fingers drumming a slow, hypnotic rhythm. His lips move almost imperceptibly, forming words only the young king can hear. When Louis speaks, the voice is his own, but the words belong entirely to the man in red. He controlled France for nearly 2 decades, but his name never appeared on a single treaty. This is the anatomy of the advisor, the most common and perhaps most effective type of invisible architect. These figures understood that official power meant nothing compared to proximity. They didn't need titles or public recognition. They needed only one thing: unlimited access to the monarch's ear. Cardinal Richelieu perfected this art form. When he became Louis XIII's chief minister, France was weak, divided, constantly threatened by internal rebellion and external enemies. Richelieu made himself indispensable by solving every crisis, crushing every threat, managing every complexity of governance. The king, overwhelmed and frankly uninterested in the grinding work of ruling, gratefully handed over more and more authority. Within years, Richelieu was making every significant decision, while Louis played with his hunting dogs and his toy soldiers. The technique was elegant in its simplicity. Control the information flowing to the monarch, and you control how the monarch understands reality. Richelieu ensured that every report, every letter, every piece of intelligence passed through his hands first. He decided what Louis heard, and when he heard it, problems were always presented as urgent crises requiring immediate decisions, creating a perpetual state of emergency that justified Richelieu's constant presence and influence. The king never had time to think, to consult others, to question the cardinal's recommendations. This pattern repeated across centuries and continents. In England, Thomas Cromwell served King Henry VIII, ostensibly as a mere secretary. But Cromwell controlled who could speak to the king, which petitions reached the throne, which laws were enforced, and which ignored. He manufactured the legal justifications for Henry's break with Rome, his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, his dissolution of the monasteries, decisions that reshaped England forever. Henry believed these were his choices, his bold leadership. In reality, Cromwell had architected everything, manipulating the king's desires and fears to achieve his own vision of religious and political transformation. The advisors understood something crucial. Monarchs were almost always kept deliberately ignorant. Royal children were raised in isolation, taught ceremony and protocol, but rarely exposed to actual governance. They learned how to look powerful, without learning how power actually worked. When they inherited the throne, they found themselves responsible for managing complex kingdoms they didn't understand. The seasoned advisors who had served their fathers, who knew every noble family, every political faction, every financial detail, became lifelines. Monarchs clung to these advisors out of desperate necessity. Manufactured dependence became a refined art. Create a crisis, then solve it. Make yourself indispensable, then demand more authority to prevent future crises. Repeat until the monarch cannot imagine governing without you. The advisor who controlled access to the king controlled everything. No one could present alternative viewpoints. No one could warn the monarch about manipulation. No one could break the spell. Late-night meetings proved particularly effective. An advisor who could access the king's private chambers after dark, when exhaustion made resistance difficult, could plant ideas that felt like the monarch's own thoughts by morning. Richelieu often visited Louis late at night, speaking softly about threats to the kingdom, about the king's sacred duty, about the necessity of difficult choices. By dawn, Louis believed the cardinal's plans were his own convictions. Then there were figures like Rasputin, who took this dynamic to supernatural extremes. The Siberian mystic gained influence over Russian Tsarina Alexandra by claiming he could heal her hemophiliac son. The desperate mother gave him unlimited access to the royal family, and through her, to the Tsar himself. Rasputin's advice shaped Russian policy during World War I, influenced ministerial appointments, and contributed to the dynasty's eventual collapse. He had no official position, no political experience, no qualifications whatsoever, only proximity to power and the ability to manipulate those who held it. The pattern was always the same: get close, become necessary, control information, manufacture crises, whisper solutions. The king believes he rules while the advisor actually governs. History remembers the monarch's name while the advisor's machinations fade into footnotes. But advisors weren't the only ones whispering secrets in royal ears. Sometimes the most powerful voice came from the royal bed itself. She never sat on the throne, but every night the king slept in her power. The royal bedchamber was the most potent political arena in any palace, yet historians consistently underestimated it because it was private, intimate, impossible to document with the same precision as public ceremonies. What happened between a king and queen in darkness left no official record, no witnesses, no paper trail. But those conversations, those whispered requests in moments of vulnerability, shaped kingdoms as surely as any council meeting or battlefield victory. Queen's consort existed in a strange paradox. Officially they were subordinate, women in societies that denied them legal authority, wives in marriages that gave husbands absolute power. But they possessed something no advisor, no general, no minister could claim: constant, unsupervised access to the most powerful man in the realm. While advisors competed for scheduled audiences and fought for the king's attention during formal meetings, queens lived with their husbands. They shared meals, chambers, beds. They saw monarchs not as public figures, but as private men, tired, worried, insecure, human. Eleanor of Aquitaine understood this better than perhaps any woman in medieval history. When she married King Louis VII of France, she was already one of the wealthiest women in Europe, controlling vast territories. But wealth meant nothing without political influence, and Louis initially saw her as merely a beautiful ornament. Eleanor learned to wait for the right moments. After victories that made Louis expansive and generous, during illnesses that made him vulnerable, in the deep hours of night when defenses were lowest. She whispered about territories she thought should be acquired, about advisors she believed were disloyal, about policies that would strengthen France. Louis believed these were pillow talk, idle conversation. He never realized his queen was conducting foreign policy from their bed. When that marriage ended and Eleanor married Henry II of England, she refined her techniques even further. She controlled Henry's domestic environment completely, managing when he ate, when he slept, who had access to their private chambers. She timed her political requests to coincide with moments of intimacy, understanding that a man's judgment softens when his other appetites have just been satisfied. She bore him 8 children, and each birth increased her leverage. The king needed his wife not just for companionship, but for the dynasty's survival. Catherine de' Medici took these tactics to darker extremes. Married to King Henry II of France, she found herself initially powerless, overshadowed by the king's mistress. But Catherine was patient. She studied her husband, learned his patterns, understood his fears. When Henry died and her young son became king, Catherine found herself in the perfect position. Mother to the monarch, widow to the former king, controller of the new king's entire environment. She shaped her son Francis II through constant presence, through emotional manipulation disguised as maternal love. When Francis died and his younger brother Charles X took the throne, Catherine simply repeated the process. She ruled France through 3 successive sons, each of whom believed he was making his own decisions while actually dancing to his mother's choreography. The bedroom gave queens other weapons too. Royal marriages were political transactions, but they still involved human emotion. A king who genuinely loved his wife became vulnerable to her influence in ways no amount of protocol could prevent. Queens learned to weaponize affection, to grant and withhold intimacy strategically, to make their approval something the king craved and feared losing. Alexandra Feodorovna of Russia demonstrates the ultimate expression of bedroom politics. Tsar Nicholas II was weak-willed and overwhelmed by the responsibilities of ruling the vast Russian Empire. Alexandra became his entire world: advisor, confidante, emotional support, political guide. She controlled his schedule, screened his correspondence, determined which ministers had access to him. Most devastatingly, she fell under the influence of Rasputin and brought his poison directly into the Tsar's ear. Nicholas trusted his wife absolutely, never questioning her judgment, never suspecting that his complete emotional dependence on Alexandra was being exploited by those who manipulated her. The power of the bedchamber worked because it was invisible. No one could observe it, no one could counter it, and the kings themselves rarely recognized they were being controlled. They believed they were simply taking counsel from their wives, never understanding that counsel was carefully calibrated manipulation. But not all intimate relationships that shaped kingdoms were sanctioned by marriage. Some of the most powerful were hidden behind scandal and secrecy. History called her a harlot, but she appointed generals, funded artists, and ruled France from the shadows. Madame de Pompadour was never supposed to matter. She was born Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, a commoner in a society obsessed with bloodlines. She became the official mistress of King Louis IV through calculated charm and deliberate positioning. And then for nearly 20 years she became the real power behind the French throne. The mistress occupied a unique space in royal politics. Queens were chosen for diplomatic reasons, their marriages arranged to seal alliances between kingdoms. They were political necessities, rarely selected for compatibility or affection. But mistresses were different. Kings chose them freely, based on attraction, personality, intellectual connection. This made the relationship more genuine and, paradoxically, gave mistresses more actual influence than wives who were merely fulfilling dynastic obligations. Pompadour understood this advantage completely. She made herself indispensable not through beauty alone, though she was beautiful, but through intelligence and utility. She managed the king's social calendar, transforming boring state functions into entertaining gatherings. She surrounded Louis with artists, philosophers, and interesting minds, making his life stimulating. She listened to his problems, offered advice on matters of state, and gradually became his most trusted counselor. Ministers who wanted royal approval learned to seek her endorsement first. Ambassadors courted her favor. She appointed military commanders, influenced diplomatic appointments, and directed France's cultural patronage. The Palace of Versailles operated on her approval. Diane de Poitiers achieved similar power in an earlier century. She became the mistress of King Henry II of France when he was still a prince, 19 years her junior. The age gap gave her maternal authority combined with sexual power, a devastating combination. When Henry took the throne, Diane became the kingdom's unofficial ruler. She signed official documents, received ambassadors, distributed royal appointments. Henry's actual queen, Catherine de' Medici, watched helplessly as her husband's mistress governed France. The humiliation was public and absolute, yet Catherine could do nothing. Henry loved Diane with obsessive devotion, trusting her judgment on everything from military strategy to architectural projects. The power of mistresses came partly from their precarious position. Unlike queens, who were protected by marriage contracts and dynastic considerations, mistresses could be dismissed instantly. This vulnerability made them highly motivated to maintain royal favor through constant attentiveness and usefulness. They couldn't afford to bore the king, to displease him, to become complacent. This competitive pressure often made them better at maintaining influence than queens who took their positions for granted. Mistresses also faced less court scrutiny in some ways. Queens attended endless formal functions, their every move watched and reported. But mistresses existed in the grey spaces of court life, present but not official, powerful but not accountable. This ambiguity gave them room to maneuver, to have private meetings, to build networks without constant observation. Nell Gwyn, mistress to King Charles II of England, demonstrated how charm and wit could translate into political influence. Unlike many royal mistresses who came from noble families, Nell was an actress and orange seller, about as common as backgrounds got. Yet Charles adored her for exactly that reason. She was genuine, funny, unpretentious. She made him laugh after tedious state meetings, and gradually that emotional connection gave her political leverage. She advocated for religious tolerance, influenced military appointments, and secured pensions for allies. Charles trusted her judgment precisely because she seemed to want nothing for herself. Though of course she did want things, she was simply clever enough to disguise ambition as concern. But history rarely remembered mistresses kindly. The same historians who celebrated kings for their wisdom vilified their mistresses as temptresses and manipulators. Pompadour was blamed for France's military failures during the 7 Years' War, though she had merely endorsed strategies proposed by professional military advisors. Diane de Poitiers was portrayed as a predatory older woman who corrupted an innocent prince, though Henry pursued her obsessively. The double standard was absolute. Kings were powerful men making choices. Mistresses were scheming women wielding inappropriate influence. The fall of a mistress could be swift and brutal. When the king died or grew tired, the power evaporated instantly. Many ended their lives in convents or poverty, discarded after years of service. Their wealth, usually gifts from the king, could be confiscated. Their children, if any, were often stripped of titles and inheritance. The power had always been borrowed, never truly owned. Yet while women manipulated power through intimate relationships, other forces controlled monarchs through something even more fundamental, their souls. He could command armies, but a single priest could bring him to his knees in terror. Power has many sources, but in the deeply religious societies that dominated most of human history, no force proved more potent than the threat of eternal damnation. Kings might ignore advisors, dismiss ministers, even defy their own families, but very few could stand firm when a priest told them their immortal soul hung in the balance. Religious figures understood this vulnerability and learned to exploit it with devastating effectiveness. The confessional became the ultimate intelligence gathering operation. Catholic monarchs were required to confess their sins regularly to a priest, revealing their deepest fears, darkest secrets, and most shameful acts. The priest who heard a king's confession knew everything: the extramarital affairs, the corrupt dealings, the moments of doubt and weakness. This knowledge created extraordinary leverage. A confessor didn't need to explicitly threaten exposure. The mere fact of knowing was enough to bend the monarch's will. Spanish kings were particularly vulnerable to this dynamic. Their father confessors became shadow rulers, present at all important meetings, consulted on every major decision. These priests framed political questions as moral ones, transforming matters of state into matters of salvation. Should Spain go to war? The confessor would speak of just war theory, of Christian duty, of sins of aggression versus sins of cowardice. The king, desperate to ensure his place in heaven, accepted the confessor's interpretation as divine guidance. What appeared to be royal policy was often priestly agenda dressed in theological language. Pope Innocent III perfected the weaponization of spiritual authority on a grander scale. When King John of England defied papal wishes in the early 13th century, Innocent didn't send armies. He sent something far more terrifying, an interdict. Churches throughout England closed. Priests could not perform marriages, baptisms, or last rites. The dead were buried in unconsecrated ground. Innocent made an entire kingdom spiritually radioactive, and the population blamed their king for bringing God's wrath upon them. John, facing not just papal displeasure, but potential uprising from his own terrified subjects, surrendered completely. He accepted the Pope as his feudal overlord, agreeing to pay annual tribute. A king who commanded one of Europe's most powerful realms became a vassal through spiritual coercion. Excommunication served as an even more personal weapon. To be excommunicated meant being cast out from the church, denied salvation, condemned to eternal hellfire. For genuinely faithful monarchs, this prospect was more terrifying than any earthly threat. Religious figures wielded excommunication like a blade held to the king's throat, invisible to others but absolutely real to the victim. Monarchs made enormous political concessions, abandoned allies, reversed policies, anything to avoid or reverse excommunication. The most effective religious manipulators were those who genuinely believed their own narrative. A cynical priest playing political games could be detected and resisted, but a confessor who truly believed he was saving the king's soul, who wept real tears over royal sins, who stayed up nights praying for his monarch's redemption, such a figure was nearly impossible to resist. His sincerity made his manipulation invisible even to himself. He wasn't controlling the king for personal gain, but guiding him towards salvation. That the path to salvation happened to align with the priest's political objectives seemed like divine providence rather than calculated strategy. Some monarchs tried to resist. They appointed less scrupulous confessors or ignored religious counsel. But these kings faced enormous pressure from their subjects, who expected their ruler to be pious, and from their own psychology, shaped since childhood to fear hell. Even skeptical monarchs often found themselves vulnerable during illness or approaching death, when thoughts of the afterlife became urgent and priests gained renewed influence. The genius of religious control was its invisibility. An advisor giving political counsel could be questioned, dismissed, replaced. But a priest speaking with God's authority couldn't be challenged without challenging God himself. The manipulation wore the mask of devotion, making resistance seem like sin. Religious figures created dependence through manufactured guilt. They defined sins so broadly that even routine royal activities, the violence of maintaining order, the deceptions of diplomacy, the compromises of governance, became spiritual crises requiring priestly intervention. The king needed constant absolution, constant guidance, constant reassurance that he wasn't damning himself with every decision. This dependency gave religious advisors permanent leverage, but religious control wasn't always institutional. Sometimes a single mystic or prophet could hold more power than the entire church. They called him a holy man. But was he a healer, a hypnotist, or something darker? Grigori Rasputin arrived in St. Petersburg in 1903. A filthy peasant from Siberia with tangled hair, wild eyes, and a reputation for miracles. The aristocracy found him repulsive and fascinating in equal measure, but when Tsarina Alexandra brought him to the bedside of her dying son, everything changed. Alexei Romanov suffered from hemophilia, a genetic disorder that turned every bump and bruise into a potential death sentence. The best doctors in Russia stood helpless as the young heir bled internally, screaming in agony. Then Rasputin entered the room. He knelt beside the bed, placed his rough peasant hands on the boy's fevered forehead, and stared into his eyes with an intensity that seemed to pull consciousness from one soul to another. He spoke in low, rhythmic tones. Within hours, the bleeding stopped. Alexei slept peacefully for the first time in days. No one could explain it. Medical records confirm the pattern repeated multiple times. The heir would suffer a hemophiliac crisis. Doctors would despair, Rasputin would arrive, and the child would recover. Whether through hypnosis that reduced blood pressure, through psychological comfort that eased stress, induced symptoms through pure coincidence, or through something science could measure, Rasputin could do what no trained physician could manage. He could save the heir to the Russian throne. This made him indispensable. Alexandra fell completely under his influence, believing God had sent this holy man to save her son. She called him our friend, consulted him on everything from medical matters to military strategy. Rasputin had no political experience, no education, no qualifications whatsoever, but he had access to the Tsarina Essia, and through her, to the Tsar himself. During World War I, as Nicholas commanded armies from the front, Alexandra effectively ran the government from the palace, and she ran it according to Rasputin's whispered advice. The pattern of desperate royals turning to charismatic mystics repeats throughout history. In 15th century Florence, the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola gained such power over the city that he effectively overthrew the Medici family and established a theocratic republic. Savonarola preached apocalyptic sermons that terrified his audiences, convincing them that divine judgment was imminent. Citizens burned their luxuries in bonfires of the vanities, destroyed their art and books, confessed their sins in public squares. The city's rulers, paralyzed by religious terror mixed with genuine spiritual conviction, allowed a fanatical monk to dictate policy until his execution 4 years later. Joan of Arc represents perhaps the most mysterious case. A teenage peasant girl convinced the Dauphin of France that she heard voices from God commanding her to lead French armies against the English. Charles VII, desperate and militarily defeated, did something inexplicable. He believed her. He gave an illiterate farm girl command over professional soldiers, and impossibly, she won. Her presence at Orléans turned a losing siege into a decisive victory. Whether through military genius hidden in a simple girl, through the psychological impact of soldiers believing they fought with divine favor, or through forces that defy rational explanation, Joan changed the course of the 100 Years' War and secured Charles' coronation. What these figures shared was the ability to fill a void in desperate people. Rasputin offered hope to parents watching their child die. Savonarola offered certainty to a population exhausted by corruption and warfare. Joan offered victory to a defeated prince. They positioned themselves as conduits for higher power, whether divine intervention or psychological transformation, making themselves impossible to refuse. Their power was always precarious. Rasputin was murdered by nobles who saw him as a threat to Russia itself. Savonarola was excommunicated and burned. Joan was captured and executed as a heretic. Charismatic power burns bright and dies violently, but while it lasts, it can topple kingdoms. The ambiguity remains. Were they genuine mystics or brilliant manipulators? Did Rasputin truly heal, or did he simply understand psychology better than the doctors? Did Joan actually hear divine voices, or did she weaponize her own delusions? History offers evidence for both interpretations, but proves neither conclusively. While spiritual manipulation worked on the faithful, other puppet masters used something more tangible: money, land, and the power of noble blood. He wore the crown, but they owned the land, controlled the armies, and held the purse strings. Individual manipulators, advisors, lovers, priests could control a monarch's decisions, but the most comprehensive form of control operated at a structural level, woven into the very fabric of how kingdoms functioned. Aristocratic families, collectively and through interconnected networks, created systems that made genuine royal independence virtually impossible. Consider the French ancient regime before the Revolution. The king was supposedly absolute, his word divine law, but examine how power actually flowed. The great noble families, the Condés, the Rohans, the Montmorencys, controlled vast territories, maintained private armies, administered local justice, and collected taxes. The king in Paris could issue decrees, but those decrees meant nothing if provincial nobles refused to enforce them. Royal authority depended entirely on aristocratic cooperation. These families were interconnected through generations of strategic marriages, creating a web of kinship that functioned almost like a distributed nervous system. An insult to one family activated obligations across dozens of others. A favor granted to one noble created expectations among all his relatives and allies. The king navigated this network constantly, balancing competing interests, never able to favor one faction without alienating others. Royal debt gave nobles even more leverage. Monarchs borrowed enormous sums to fund wars, build palaces, maintain courts. The lenders were aristocrats who could afford such investments. A king who owed millions to noble families couldn't easily oppose their interests. The The debt was more than financial, it was political obligation woven into the kingdom's economic foundation. The German states demonstrated collective aristocratic control even more clearly. The Holy Roman Emperor supposedly ruled, but actual power resided with the princes who elected him. These electoral princes, dukes, archbishops, and kings of component kingdoms formed a college that could make or break emperors. An emperor needed their consent for nearly every significant decision. He was simultaneously the highest authority and completely dependent on those beneath him, a paradox that made independent action nearly impossible. Land ownership proved fundamental to this aristocratic control. In agrarian societies, land was wealth, and wealth was power. Nobles who controlled vast estates controlled the resources those estates produced: grain for feeding armies, wood for building ships, men for serving as soldiers. A monarch with a small royal domain depended entirely on nobles to supply the resources needed for governance. When nobles collectively refused support, the king became powerless. Noble councils institutionalized this collective control. Bodies like the English Parliament, the Spanish court, or the Polish Sejm officially advised the monarch. But advice from an assembly that controlled most of the kingdom's wealth and military force was indistinguishable from command. Kings who ignored these councils found their policies unenforced, their treasuries empty, their armies unmobilized. The genius of this system was its resilience. Individual manipulators could be dismissed, exiled, even executed. But a king couldn't exile the entire aristocracy without destroying his own power base. The system was self-perpetuating. Nobles trained their children to navigate these networks, arranged marriages to strengthen alliances, and passed down both wealth and political connections across generations. Even supposedly absolute monarchs like Louis XIV, who famously declared "État cod est moi," I am the state, operated within these constraints. Louis spent decades carefully managing aristocratic factions, using patronage and ceremony to keep nobles dependent on royal favor, while simultaneously depending on them for actual governance. His absolutism was performance art, brilliant theater that masked the complex negotiations happening constantly behind palace doors. The narrative of powerful kings commanding obedient subjects was always fiction. The reality was negotiation, compromise, and constraint, power distributed across networks that no single person, not even the monarch, could fully control. Yet while men built these complex networks of control, history has hidden the greatest secret of all, that many kingdoms were actually ruled by queens who history has deliberately erased. She ruled for 22 years, expanded an empire, and commissioned architectural wonders. Then her successor erased her face from every monument in Egypt. Hatshepsut was one of ancient Egypt's most successful pharaohs. She stabilized the kingdom after years of uncertainty, established trade routes that brought unprecedented wealth, and built the magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari that still stands today. She ruled not as queen regent for a child king, but as pharaoh in her own right, wearing the false beard and royal regalia traditionally reserved for men. Egypt prospered under her reign in ways it hadn't for generations. Then she died, and her stepson Thutmose III took the throne. Within years, workers began systematically destroying evidence of her rule. They chiseled her face off statues. They scratched her name from inscriptions. They toppled her obelisks and buried her monuments. The campaign was thorough and deliberate, designed to remove her from historical memory so completely that future generations wouldn't even know a woman had once held absolute power in Egypt. This wasn't vandalism. This was historical erasure as state policy. The pattern repeats across civilizations and centuries. Whenever women achieved real power, the historical record found ways to diminish, distort, or delete their accomplishments. Sometimes the erasure was violent and immediate, like Hatshepsut's defaced monuments. More often, it was subtle, happening gradually through how stories were told and retold, through what historians chose to emphasize and what they chose to forget. Wu Zetian became the only woman to ever rule China as emperor in her own right, not as regent or consort. She rose from concubine to empress to emperor across decades of brilliant political maneuvering. During her reign, she expanded the empire's territory, reformed the bureaucracy to promote officials based on merit rather than aristocratic birth, and patronized Buddhism in ways that transformed Chinese culture. She ruled competently for 15 years, maintaining stability in a vast and complex empire. History remembers her primarily as a monster. The official records, written by Confucian scholars who believed female rule violated natural order, portray her as cruel, paranoid, sexually depraved. They catalogue her alleged atrocities in meticulous detail, while barely mentioning her administrative achievements. Even modern histories often frame her reign as an aberration, a temporary disruption of proper male succession, rather than as a legitimate and largely successful period of Chinese governance. The erasure takes many forms. Sometimes it is about what gets emphasized. Elizabeth I of England ruled for 45 years, defeated the Spanish Armada, established England as a global maritime power, and oversaw a golden age of literature and exploration. But ask most people what they know about Elizabeth, and they'll mention her virginity before they mention her victory over Spain. The Virgin Queen, Good Queen Bess, Gloriana. The nicknames focus on her unmarried status, not her strategic brilliance. Her choice to remain single becomes the defining fact, as if ruling one of Europe's most powerful nations for nearly half a century was somehow less significant than her personal relationship status. Sometimes the erasure is geographic and cultural. Queen Zinga of Ndongo and Matamba in 17th century Angola was one of history's great military strategists. She fought Portuguese colonizers for 4 decades using guerrilla tactics, diplomatic maneuvering, and strategic alliances to preserve her kingdom's independence far longer than seemed possible. She personally led troops in battle into her 60s. She negotiated treaties as an equal with European powers who were accustomed to viewing Africans as subjects, not sovereigns. Western history barely remembers her name. She appears in specialized books about African history or women's history, but almost never in general historical narratives. The colonial period is taught as European expansion, not African resistance. The military strategies that preserved her kingdom for decades don't receive the analysis and admiration that European generals' tactics receive. Her story is available to those who seek it, but deliberately excluded from standard historical education. This erasure was systematic because it was necessary. Patriarchal societies rested on the claim that women were naturally unsuited for power, intellectually inferior, emotionally unstable, physically weak. Every successful female ruler contradicted that narrative. Every woman who governed competently, won military victories, maintained political stability, proved the lie at the foundation of male supremacy. So the historical record found solutions. Successful queens became exceptions, unnatural anomalies rather than proof that women could rule. Their accomplishments were attributed to male advisors who really made the decisions. Their reigns were framed as temporary disruptions of proper order. Their personal lives, marriages, children, romantic relationships received more attention than their policies and achievements. The message was clear: even when women held power, what mattered most about them was still their relationship to men and their reproductive functions. The architects of historical narratives understood that controlling the past meant controlling the present. If people believed women had never successfully ruled, they would accept that women should never rule. The erasure wasn't accidental or incidental. It was foundational to maintaining systems of power that excluded half of humanity. But some queens didn't wait to be erased. They disguised their power so well that historians still debate who really ruled. She signed every decree with her son's name, but everyone at court knew who really ruled France. Catherine de' Medici understood something fundamental about power in patriarchal societies. Visible female authority triggered resistance, but invisible female authority could accomplish anything. For 3 decades, she controlled France through 3 successive sons, Francis II, Charles X, and Henry III, each of whom sat on the throne while she governed from the shadows. The performance was masterful. In public, Catherine deferred to her sons, speaking softly, positioning herself physically behind the throne rather than on it. She framed her involvement as maternal concern, not political ambition. When she issued orders, they came officially from the king. When she negotiated with foreign ambassadors, she did so as the king's representative. The paperwork always bore her son's signature and seal, never her own. But everyone at court understood the reality. Ambassadors knew to secure Catherine's approval before approaching the king. Ministers presented proposals to her first. Military commanders awaited her decisions disguised as royal commands. She managed France's finances, directed its foreign policy, decided which nobles received appointments and which faced disgrace. The young kings she controlled were often more interested in pleasure than governance, content to let their mother handle the exhausting work of actually ruling while they enjoyed the privileges of the throne. This wasn't weakness or manipulation in the traditional sense. This was strategic genius. Catherine recognized that patriarchal systems wouldn't accept overt female rule, but couldn't prevent covert female authority if it was executed skillfully enough. She weaponized expectations about motherhood, transforming the role of concerned parent into a vehicle for absolute power. Who could object to a mother guiding her sons? Who could call it inappropriate for a widow to help her children manage their inheritance? Maria Theresa of Austria played a different variation of the same strategy. When her father died, leaving her to inherit the Habsburg domains, half of Europe immediately moved to challenge her succession. Frederick the Great of Prussia invaded. France prepared for war. Her own advisors doubted whether a woman could hold the empire together. Maria Theresa responded by deliberately performing femininity while conducting ruthless realpolitik. She appeared before the Hungarian Diet visibly pregnant, appealing to their chivalry and their traditional loyalty to the Habsburg family. She wept strategically in meetings with ministers, using emotional displays to disarm opposition while simultaneously making decisions of military and diplomatic precision. She bore 16 children across 20 years, turning maternity from potential weakness into her greatest strength. Each child became a diplomatic asset, married off to secure alliances across Europe. Her performance was exhausting and brilliant. In public, she presented herself as a pious maternal figure concerned primarily with her family and her Catholic faith. In private, she micromanaged every detail of governance, reading all diplomatic correspondence, making final decisions on military strategy, personally reviewing appointments throughout the imperial bureaucracy. She worked longer hours than most of her male officials while simultaneously managing a household of 16 children and maintaining the appearance of domestic femininity. The psychological toll of such performance cannot be overstated. These queens couldn't afford a single mistake. Male monarchs could be incompetent, lazy, or cruel and still retain their thrones through hereditary right. Female rulers faced constant scrutiny, constant challenges to their legitimacy, constant pressure to justify their authority. They had to be not just competent but exceptional, not just hard-working but tireless, not just strategic but brilliant. This pressure paradoxically made them better rulers than many of their male counterparts. They couldn't coast on hereditary legitimacy or gender privilege. Every decision required careful calculation. Every action needed to serve multiple purposes, achieving the immediate political goal, while also reinforcing their authority and countering assumptions about female incapacity. They became master strategists because survival demanded it, but the performance exacted a price beyond exhaustion. These women had to constantly deny their own accomplishments, attributing success to male relatives or divine providence rather than their own intelligence and effort. They couldn't celebrate victories publicly or take credit for brilliant decisions. The very skill that kept them in power also ensured their contributions would be minimized by history. Catherine de' Medici's diplomatic genius preserved France during brutal religious civil wars. Maria Theresa's military and political acumen kept the Habsburg Empire intact against existential threats. But histories often portray Catherine as a scheming mother and Maria Theresa as a baby-making machine who happened to rule between pregnancies, diminishing strategic brilliance into feminine stereotypes. Yet not all powerful queens chose disguise. Some seized power so completely that no one could deny it, even if it terrified them. She ruled the largest empire on earth, led armies into battle, took lovers openly, and dared any man to question her. And when they did, she crushed them. Catherine the Great of Russia seized power through a military coup against her own husband, then ruled for 34 years with an iron will that brooked no resistance. She wasn't born to the throne. She wasn't even Russian. She was a minor German princess who married into the Romanov dynasty. But she studied relentlessly, learned Russian fluently, converted to orthodoxy sincerely, and understood Russian politics better than the native-born nobles who surrounded her. When her incompetent husband Peter III threatened to destroy everything she'd worked for, she didn't hesitate. She rallied the military, orchestrated his removal, and claimed the throne for herself. Her reign transformed Russia from a peripheral European power into a dominant empire. She expanded Russian territory massively through military conquest and diplomatic maneuvering. She patronized the arts and philosophy, corresponding with Voltaire and Diderot, positioning herself as an enlightened monarch embracing reason and progress. She took lovers openly, a succession of favorites who received titles and wealth, and refused to apologize for her sexuality or pretend to chaste widowhood. When male nobles attempted coups, she crushed them without mercy. Her authority was absolute and undeniable. Elizabeth I of England achieved similar undeniability through entirely different means. She inherited a kingdom torn by religious conflict, economically weak, and surrounded by enemies. Her legitimacy was questionable. Her father had declared her illegitimate, and Catholic Europe didn't recognize her Protestant succession. England's survival, let alone her personal power, seemed unlikely. Elizabeth transformed disadvantage into strength through brilliant myth-making. She refused to marry, declaring herself wedded to England itself. This decision, politically risky and personally costly, made her symbolically untouchable. She wasn't a woman who could be controlled through marriage or dismissed as someone's wife. She was the Virgin Queen, a quasi-religious figure standing above ordinary human relationships. She used this mythology ruthlessly, playing suitors against each other for diplomatic advantage, while never actually relinquishing power through marriage. Her 45-year reign saw England defeat the Spanish Armada, establish itself as a maritime power, and experience a cultural renaissance. She managed to be both religiously tolerant enough to avoid civil war and ruthless enough to execute rivals when necessary. She navigated constant threats, assassination plots, foreign invasions, noble conspiracies, with a political acuity that her male contemporaries grudgingly respected. Isabella of Castile achieved power through strategic partnership rather than sole sovereignty. When she married Ferdinand of Aragon, they created a genuinely equal alliance, unusual for royal marriages. Their joint rule unified Spain and funded Christopher Columbus's voyage that would reshape world history. Isabella was as involved in military campaigns as Ferdinand, as engaged in diplomatic negotiations, as central to policy decisions. But Isabella's legacy also demonstrates how absolute power corrupts regardless of gender. She and Ferdinand established the Spanish Inquisition, an apparatus of religious terror that tortured and executed thousands. They expelled Jews and Muslims from Spain, destroying communities that had existed for centuries. Isabella's religious zealotry gave her moral authority in a deeply Catholic society, but it also fueled atrocities that stain her historical legacy as thoroughly as any achievement brightens it. These undeniable queens still faced constant resistance. Elizabeth endured decades of pressure to marry, with Parliament repeatedly demanding she produce an heir. Catherine survived multiple coup attempts by male relatives who believed they had better claims to the throne. Isabella's authority was constantly questioned by nobles who couldn't accept female rulership, even when her strategic brilliance repeatedly proved itself. What made them successful was a combination of exceptional ability, favorable circumstances, and sheer ruthlessness. Elizabeth's intelligence and political skill were extraordinary, but she also benefited from England's desperate need for stability after decades of turmoil. Catherine's brilliance was undeniable, but she also had the ruthlessness to murder her way to power when necessary. Isabella's partnership with Ferdinand gave her legitimacy, but she still had to prove herself repeatedly through military and political success. They sacrificed enormously for their power. Elizabeth died alone, having never experienced romantic love or motherhood. Catherine's relationships were political calculations as much as personal connections. Isabella's religious fanaticism consumed mercy and tolerance. Power demanded everything and gave back only authority. But whether they disguised their power or displayed it openly, these queens shared one thing: they were exceptions in systems designed to break them. Most who reached for power weren't strong enough, smart enough, or lucky enough to survive. He believed he was made of glass, while his kingdom shattered around him, and wolves in human form fought over the pieces. King Charles V of France stood frozen in his chamber, absolutely still, barely breathing. He was convinced that any sudden movement would cause his body to shatter into 1,000 fragments. His physicians tried everything: reason, medication, even specially designed clothing, reinforced with iron rods to reassure him that he wouldn't break. Nothing worked. For weeks or months at a time, the King of France was effectively a statue, paralyzed by delusions. Outside his chamber, his uncles circled like predators. The Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans fought viciously for control of the government, each claiming to act in the king's best interests while actually pursuing their own power and wealth. They issued decrees in Charles's name, spent the royal treasury, made alliances and declared wars, all while the man who was supposed to be ruling lived in terror of his own imagined fragility. Mental illness created the perfect conditions for absolute control. A monarch who couldn't distinguish reality from delusion couldn't effectively govern, but the position remained. The throne sat empty while its occupant still breathed, creating a power vacuum that courtiers rushed to fill. Regency governments formed ostensibly temporary arrangements until the king recovered. But recovery often never came, and the temporary controllers of power found endless reasons to maintain their grip. George III of England suffered episodes of what historians now believe was porphyria, a genetic disorder that causes severe physical and mental symptoms. During his worst periods, he talked constantly without making sense, experienced violent mood swings, and couldn't recognize his own family. His son eventually became Prince Regent, ruling in his father's name, while the old king wandered the palace in confused agitation, occasionally restrained for his own safety and the safety of others. The tragedy deepened because these men never chose their impossible roles. Charles Vaig became king at 11 years old. George III inherited the throne at 22, already showing signs of the illness that would eventually destroy his mind. They were raised to believe they were divinely chosen, specially prepared to rule, only to discover their minds were their greatest enemies. Royal families created their own genetic nightmares through generations of strategic inbreeding. Marrying cousins preserved bloodlines and kept power within tight circles, but it also concentrated harmful genetic mutations. The Habsburg jaw became so pronounced in some generations that affected individuals could barely eat. Hemophilia devastated multiple royal houses, turning minor injuries into life-threatening crises. Mental illnesses compounded across generations as the same genetic material recombined in increasingly problematic ways. Ludwig II of Bavaria represents the aesthete, driven to madness by the collision between romantic sensibility and political reality. He built fantastical castles like Neuschwanstein, spent state funds on Wagner operas and architectural dreams, and increasingly withdrew from the actual business of governing. His ministers declared him insane and removed him from power. Whether he was genuinely mentally ill or simply incompetent and inconvenient remains debated. He died mysteriously days after his deposition, found drowned in a lake under circumstances that have never been satisfactorily explained. The system continued regardless. When monarchs went mad, the bureaucracy adjusted. Advisors governed while pretending the king still ruled. Official portraits showed dignified sovereigns, never the reality of men who believed themselves made of glass, or who raved incoherently in palace corridors. State occasions were carefully choreographed to hide incapacity, the king appearing briefly saying scripted words, then retreating while others conducted actual business. Families sometimes hid mental illness desperately, knowing that admitting incapacity might trigger succession crises or foreign invasions. They controlled who saw the monarch, what information reached the public, how the illness was characterized. A king wasn't mad, he was temporarily indisposed, suffering from exhaustion, recuperating from unnamed maladies. The fiction had to be maintained because the alternative threatened the entire structure of hereditary monarchy. The cruelty was multi-layered. These mentally ill monarchs suffered their conditions without modern psychiatric care or medication. They endured their delusions and terrors while also being used as puppets by those around them. Their illness was both genuine affliction and political opportunity for others. They were simultaneously pitiable and dangerous victims and threats. The system that created them, that bred cousins to cousins, that placed impossible responsibilities on children, that valued bloodline above all else, couldn't acknowledge its own role in producing broken minds on thrones. Instead, it simply adapted, routing power around the obstacles while maintaining the appearance of royal authority. But madness wasn't always inherited. Sometimes it was deliberately created through isolation, manipulation, and systematic psychological destruction. History tells us that weak rulers lost their thrones to stronger men, but the deeper truth is far more disturbing. Some of the most carefully broken minds in history never lost their crowns. They kept them right up until the moment everything collapsed. The people around them didn't need to kill them. They just needed to make them doubt everything, including themselves. Consider the Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and his wife Alexandra. On the surface, they were portrayed as incompetent and out of touch. But that narrative misses something crucial. Their isolation from reality wasn't accidental. It was systematically constructed by those closest to them. Every piece of information that reached the Tsar passed through filters designed by people who understood exactly what he wanted to hear. They gave it to him. The technique was elegant in its cruelty. First came control of access. The Tsar couldn't see anyone without permission from trusted advisors, not really see them, not speak with them alone where difficult truths might slip through. Every conversation was mediated, guided, shaped. The courtiers who had access to the Tsar knew one thing above all else: never give him information that contradicts what he already believes. If he believes his people love him, confirm it. If he suspects disloyalty in a particular minister, provide evidence, create the reality he expects, and he will never question it. Alexandra, meanwhile, was fed a different but equally damaging narrative. She was kept in a state of desperate isolation, told that the outside world was hostile, that courtiers were scheming against her, that only a few trusted people truly had her family's interests at heart. While Russia burned outside the palace walls, she was presented with manufactured letters from loyal subjects, filtered reports that emphasized her power rather than the government's powerlessness. She came to believe she held more influence than she actually possessed, even as her husband became increasingly paralyzed. The manipulation ran deeper still. Both the Tsar and Tsarina were praised for their devotion, their righteousness, their commitment to tradition. But woven through this flattery was something subtler, a constant reminder that they couldn't manage without guidance. They were too pure for such a corrupted world, too devoted to duty to understand political maneuvering. They needed advisors. They needed protection from harsh truths. Over time, this created a peculiar psychological state, simultaneously inflated and diminished. They felt important but helpless, powerful but incapable of actual power. The crises came one after another. Financial collapse, military defeats, disease, scandal. Each crisis was presented to them in ways that overwhelmed their ability to think clearly. Too many problems, no solutions offered, no time to recover before the next disaster arrived. Their minds remained in a state of constant emergency, unable to form coherent responses. This is learned helplessness, the psychological condition where a person becomes convinced of their own incapacity through repeated exposure to overwhelming situations they cannot control. What made them especially vulnerable was their childhood. Nicholas had been raised with the paradox of absolute authority combined with absolute scrutiny, trained that his duty was everything but never taught how to actually exercise power. Alexandra had experienced her own early traumas, losses that left her seeking certainty in an uncertain world. People raised this way, with either excessive indulgence that never taught them reality, or excessive brutality that taught them to fear, grow into adults peculiarly susceptible to this kind of systematic manipulation. They lack the internal compass that experience provides. They become mirrors for those around them. The most disturbing part of this story isn't that they lost. It is that by the time they lost, they no longer even understood what they were losing. Their perception of reality had been so thoroughly reconstructed that they couldn't see the revolution approaching until it was already at the gates. Yet some monarchs never needed this careful breaking at all. Yet some monarchs needed no breaking. They arrived at the throne already destroyed, children forced into crowns they could never fill. He was 6 years old when they placed a crown on his head and armies at his command. For the next decade, everyone lied to him about everything. This wasn't incidental to his rule. It was the entire strategy. Christina of Sweden inherited her throne as a child, and she was not alone. Across European history, kingdoms repeatedly found themselves in the hands of those barely old enough to read. Louis XIV of France ascended at 4, Edward V of England at 9. Each one sat on thrones designed for adult bodies, their small feet dangling far above the floor while the machinery of state operated around them. Imagine the scene. A child in an oversized chair. Adults standing around discussing matters of war, of famine, of executions. Then one of them turns to the child, sometimes gently, sometimes with barely concealed contempt, and asks for the ceremonial approval of decisions already made hours or days before. The child nods or speaks words someone put in their mouth. The decision is now official. The kingdom moves forward based on the judgment of someone who still needs help getting dressed. This wasn't merely inefficient, it was psychologically devastating. The regents who controlled these kingdoms understood one crucial thing. The longer they maintained their power, the wealthier and more secure they became. A child monarch who matured into an independent adult was a threat to that arrangement, so they didn't allow maturation to happen naturally. Education was controlled and often deliberately limited. Some child monarchs received only the education regents thought necessary to perform ceremonial functions. Reading, writing, basic courtly manners, but nothing that might develop independent thinking, nothing that might teach them to see through manipulation, nothing that might make them dangerous. The isolation was equally calculated. These children were often kept in restricted quarters, separated from potential allies or advisors who might strengthen them. They were surrounded by people who benefited from their weakness. Over years, some child monarchs began to internalize this arrangement. They believed themselves incapable of independent thought. They looked to their handlers for guidance, even when no guidance was being offered. Learned helplessness took root early, before their personalities had fully formed. What emerged from this trauma varied remarkably. Some child monarchs grew into adults so desperate to reclaim power that they became tyrants. Years of powerlessness created an explosion of overcorrection. Once they finally seized authority, they trusted no one and held everything with an iron grip. Louis XIV became precisely this, a child who watched regents manipulate power, then as an adult decided he would hold all power himself, forever vigilant against the betrayal he'd experienced. His entire approach to kingship was shaped by the trauma of his childhood subordination. Others never escaped their infantilization. They reached adulthood still seeking permission, still looking over their shoulders for the advisor who would tell them what to do. They held titles but not power. They remained prisoners wearing crowns. Edward V died young, and history barely knows his own wishes or beliefs because he'd never been allowed to develop them. Even now, we struggle to know who he actually was beneath the layers of control imposed on him as a child. The rarest few somehow survived relatively intact, children who, despite the system designed to break them, developed resilience or found one person who genuinely protected their growth. But these exceptions only highlight how dangerous childhood power truly was. The trauma of early authority without understanding, of being used as a symbol while real decisions happened beyond their comprehension, left scars that shaped entire reigns. Some became monsters, some remained forever dependent. All of them paid a price that no child should have to pay. The broken, the mad, the children, all were perfect targets for manipulation. The broken, the mad, the children, all were perfect targets for manipulation, but their exploitation created something dangerous. Scandals that couldn't be contained, secrets that threatened to destroy entire kingdoms. He had no claim to the throne. His mother was a servant in the royal household, his father a king who never officially acknowledged him. By law, he was a bastard, excluded from succession, barred from titles, denied the inheritance that his half-siblings took for granted. Yet for 20 years he ruled the kingdom. Everyone who held the official crown answered to him. The laws that said he couldn't inherit didn't stop him from wielding more power than any legitimate heir. This wasn't unique. This was a pattern woven through history. Illegitimacy created a strange psychological position. It was both a permanent stigma and a peculiar form of freedom. Royal bastards existed in a liminal space, close enough to power to see it, taste it, understand it, but officially excluded from inheriting it. This proximity combined with exclusion created a particular brand of dangerous ambition. A legitimate heir could afford to be cautious. They would inherit wealth and position, whether they struggled for it or not. But an illegitimate child with royal blood had no guarantee of anything. Everything had to be seized, manipulated, or bargained for. Everything was urgent. Consider Giacomo Colonna, whose father was a cardinal, whose bloodline connected him to some of Europe's most powerful families, yet whose birth placed him forever outside formal succession. Rather than accept this exclusion, Colonna maneuvered himself into positions of influence throughout church politics, wielding authority that no official title would have granted him. He was dangerous precisely because he had nothing to lose and everything to prove. His illegitimacy was both obstacle and weapon. These individuals often became military commanders, positions where competence mattered more than birthright. A bastard general could prove himself through victory in ways a legitimate courtier never could. Some became trusted advisors, manipulating policy from behind the throne. Others engineered coups, seizing power outright. The pattern repeated across continents. Illegitimate children, despised by birth yet possessed of ambition and intelligence, often outmaneuvered their legitimate rivals through sheer determination and the absence of complacency. But the real leverage came from secrecy and scandal. Some bastards were born to royal mistresses, their existence an open scandal, but their legal status unclear. As they grew older, they discovered they possessed something valuable: knowledge. They knew things about the king, about his vulnerabilities, his weaknesses. They could threaten to reveal secrets, the existence of illegitimate children itself, or circumstances of the child's conception that would damage the royal line's reputation. A bastard prince, properly leveraged, became a perpetual insurance policy for careful subjects and a nightmare for kings who feared exposure. Mothers understood this. Some noble or royal women deliberately positioned their illegitimate children as alternative power centers, threats that could be activated if legitimate heirs proved too weak or too hostile to their interests. The threat alone gave these women leverage. The king couldn't afford to ignore her requests, because everyone understood her son represented an option. If she chose to claim him, to declare his right to the throne, to gather factions around him, the succession crisis could destabilize everything. Hidden children added another layer of danger. Some royal bastards were spirited away, raised in obscurity, their lineage known only to a small circle. Then, decades later, they would emerge claiming their place, carrying proof, letters, testimonies, bloodline connections that suggested they were legitimate heirs. These revelations created succession chaos. Did this man actually have a claim? Should he be believed? Who benefited if he was? The uncertainty itself became a weapon. The modern era has intensified these scandals beyond what ancient rumor could achieve. DNA testing has revealed paternity secrets that rewrite history. Children recorded in official documents as the heirs of one king were actually fathered by another man entirely. Entire royal lines that believed themselves legitimate discover their own bastardry in genetic evidence. The blood that authorized their rule wasn't what they thought it was. These discoveries raised disturbing questions. If these lines were unknowingly illegitimate, who actually held legitimate power? Does illegitimacy matter if no one knows about it? But illegitimacy was just one secret royal families tried desperately to hide. Some scandals were so explosive they threatened to destroy entire dynasties, not through the claims of bastards, but through the revelation of sins far darker than mere illegitimate birth. But there was a problem that monarchs hadn't fully anticipated. Secrets, by their very nature, resist containment. And when royal secrets escaped into the wider world, they didn't dissolve quietly into mere rumor. They metastasized into something far more dangerous. They became undeniable truth. In 1784, a magnificent diamond necklace vanished from a jeweler's workshop in Paris. What followed was simply a theft. It was the unraveling of everything the French crown had so carefully constructed around itself. Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, had not purchased the necklace, yet her name was attached to its purchase. A cardinal had been deceived. A woman claiming to represent the Queen had orchestrated an elaborate fraud. And when the truth emerged in the courts of law, where it could be suppressed or rewritten, Paris consumed every detail with an appetite that terrified the palace. The diamond necklace affair, as history would name it, was a single thread. But when pulled, it unraveled the entire tapestry of royal legitimacy. It wasn't the necklace itself that truly mattered. It was what the necklace proved. It proved that the Queen was either complicit in fraud or so profoundly distant from reality that she could distinguish truth from deception. It proved that even the church could be manipulated by royal schemes. It proved that the gap between what the monarchy claimed to be and what it actually was had become so vast that no amount of ceremony or invocation of divine right could bridge it. The people of Paris read about it in underground pamphlets. They sang about it in the streets. Artists sketched political cartoons showing the Queen adorned with stolen jewels, her face twisted in greed. In an age before newspapers controlled information, before governments could effectively suppress unflattering truths, scandal flowed like water finding cracks in stone. And once it had flowed, there was no containing it. But the diamond necklace affair was not an isolated catastrophe. 2 centuries earlier, Louis XIV's court had been engulfed by something far darker. The affair of the poisons, they called it, and it revealed that the very heart of absolute power was riddled with moral corruption, so profound it seemed almost theatrical in its depravity. Women in the king's inner circle had been consulting poisoners. Courtiers had been eliminating rivals through toxins slipped into wine. A fortune teller confessed to assisting in ritual murders. When the investigation spiraled outward, it implicated dozens of aristocrats, even touching the king's own mistress. The scandal was so shocking that Louis XIV himself shut it down, fearing the damage would consume the entire institution of monarchy if it continued. But the knowledge persisted. It lived in whispered conversations, in private letters, in the collective memory of those who had witnessed the trials. Private corruption had become public knowledge, and public knowledge was a weapon monarchy could fight across Europe, and centuries later in Russia. Another scandal erupted that would carry even more ominous weight. The murder of Grigori Rasputin in 1916 seemed on its surface the assassination of a single man. But Rasputin's death exposed something the Romanov court could never recover from. It revealed that the royal family had allowed a depraved mystic to influence the very fate of an empire. It showed that at the heart of Russian power sat not wisdom or divine guidance, but desperation, gullibility, and a family so detached from reality that they believed a man who couldn't read prophecy could heal their son's bleeding condition. When photographs of Rasputin circulated, when his autopsy details became public knowledge, when the Russian people understood how thoroughly they had been ruled by the whims of a corrupt holy man and a family too broken to stop him, the legitimacy of the Romanov dynasty didn't simply crack. It shattered. Each scandal followed the same essential pattern. Private secrets became public truths. The gap between royal image and royal reality was exposed so thoroughly that it could never be unseen. And once seen, once spoken aloud in pamphlets and songs and street conversations, once distributed beyond the palace walls where authority once held absolute power, something fundamental shifted. The mystique that monarchy depended upon didn't regenerate. It corroded. But there was something even more fundamental than scandal, even more destabilizing than corruption. There was the question of blood itself. Who actually deserved to wear the crown, and how could anyone ever truly know? Throughout history, monarchy rested on a single terrifying assumption that biological descent from a royal ancestor justified absolute power. Divine right wasn't just about God. His favor, it was about bloodline. The royal blood was different, purer, sacred. And yet, this entire philosophical edifice was built on something that could truly be verified. In an age without DNA tests, without genetic science, without any real way to prove parentage, the crown depended entirely on trust, on documentation, on the word of midwives and courtiers and people standing in a room when a child was born. This vulnerability created opportunities that some could resist. In 1688, England erupted into what became known as the warming pan scandal. James II's wife had given birth to a son, a male heir who would displace James' Protestant daughters and preserve Catholic succession. But whispers began almost immediately. A warming pan filled with hot coals meant to warm a bed was said to have been used to smuggle a baby into the royal chamber. The child wasn't really the king's biological son. The rumors claimed he was an imposter. The story was never proven. The warming pan was never found. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. Enough people believed it possible, believed it plausible, believed that a king might fake his own bloodline to protect his dynasty. Enough people were willing to overturn a succession based on doubt, and they did. Centuries later, in 1828, a mysterious young man appeared in Nuremberg, Germany, claiming he was Caspar Hauser, a lost prince who had been imprisoned his entire life to prevent him from claiming his rightful throne. Hauser had no memories of his past, no documentation of his identity, nothing but his own testimony that he was royalty in hiding. He became a sensation. Romantics saw him as a tragic prince, betrayed by powerful enemies. Skeptics saw him as a deliberate hoax or a delusional man. But the very fact that Caspar Hauser could convince some people that his claim to hidden royalty was at least plausible enough to merit investigation revealed something important. The crown's legitimacy was fragile. Identity was uncertain. A person could appear from nowhere claiming royal blood, and the answer to, "Are you really who you say you are?" wasn't. Science has only deepened this crisis of legitimacy. When geneticists began analyzing the remains of various royal families when DNA evidence became available, what they discovered was startling. Some of Europe's most prominent royal lines weren't biologically descended from their supposed ancestors. Cuckoldry in the royal bedchamber had rewritten genetic history. Children switched at birth, unacknowledged illegitimate heirs, infidelities by queens and kings. The biological reality of countless royal families didn't match the official genealogies written in books and preserved in archives. The implications were philosophically destabilizing. If a royal line wasn't actually descended from their founding ancestor, were they legitimate? Did their divine right still apply? If a false heir had ruled competently for decades, had governed wisely and justly, did biological truth matter? At what point does a lie, maintained long enough and universally accepted, become indistinguishable from truth? These weren't abstract questions. They were the fault lines running beneath monarchy itself. The entire system claimed to rest on bloodline, on descent, on biological destiny. But if that bloodline could be forged, stolen, confused, or simply false, then what remained? What justification for power persisted when the foundation it claimed to rest upon was revealed as fiction? Every deception about succession created vulnerability. Every hidden illegitimate heir, every switched child, every concealed infidelity was a secret waiting to explode. And in an age where secrets increasingly found their way into public knowledge, where truth had a way of emerging despite efforts to bury it, these accumulated biological lies were becoming impossible to ignore. Marie Antoinette was 22 years old when she arrived in France. She was a pawn, sent from Austria to seal an alliance through marriage, trained her entire life for a role she didn't choose. She would spend her final days in a wooden cart, rolling through Parisian streets toward the guillotine, spat upon by crowds who had transformed her into the symbol of everything they despised about monarchy. But she wasn't responsible for the system that destroyed her. She was, rather, its final victim. And its perpetuator Versailles, when she first saw it, must have seemed like the culmination of everything power could construct. The mirrors, the gardens, the pageantry, all designed to project an image of absolute authority and divine favor. But what she was entering wasn't a palace, it was a theater, and she was walking onto a stage where the script had been written centuries before her birth. The deceptions she inherited were staggering in their accumulation. The courtiers who surrounded her weren't servants but competitors, each one maneuvering for advantage, each one exploiting the weakness of a young queen who didn't understand yet how thoroughly she was being manipulated. Louis XVI, her husband, was a man of moderate intelligence, trapped in a role requiring the political cunning of a fox. The kingdom he nominally ruled was actually run by factions who had learned over generations how to use the appearance of absolute monarchy while wielding the actual power themselves. And Marie Antoinette, trying to find agency in a world where she was supposed to be powerless, began spending money, extravagant sums, fortunes spent on clothes and jewels and the accumulation of luxury goods, each purchase an attempt to assert identity in a world designed to deny her any. She didn't understand, couldn't have understood, that the poverty spreading through France made her spending not just conspicuous but inflammatory. But it was the diamond necklace affair that truly transformed her from queen to symbol. When the scandal exploded, when Parisians learned that their queen was potentially complicit in jewelry fraud, the image of Versailles cracked. The theatre's lighting flickered. People began to suspect that the divinely chosen monarch they'd been taught to revere might actually be a vain, gullible woman, indifferent to her kingdom's suffering. What had been sacred became ridiculous. What had been authority became mockery. The revolution, when it came, felt sudden to those who lived through it, but it wasn't sudden, it was inevitable. The system that had functioned through collective deception for centuries was finally encountering people who were no longer willing to believe. The pamphlets, the songs, the underground newspapers, all the channels through which truth had been seeping for decades had done their work. An entire population had gradually seen through the theatre. They understood, finally, that the king wasn't divine, the queen wasn't ethereal, the nobility wasn't superior by any law beyond the law they themselves had written. What made the French Revolution so violent wasn't sudden anger. It was the accumulated fury of generations, finally unleashed. The anger of people who had been systematically lied to, whose lives had been constrained by elaborate fictions, whose suffering had been justified through claims of divine order and royal righteousness. And now, seeing the reality behind the theatre, they tore it down. Marie Antoinette, as she climbed the scaffold, was being executed not for her individual failings, though she had them, but for the sins of a system she represented. She was paying for what her predecessors had hidden. She was paying for Versailles, that magnificent deception designed to make the subjugation of millions appear glorious. She was paying for the courtiers who had hidden real power behind the fiction of royal authority. She was paying for all the scandals that had exposed the gap between royal image and royal reality. Louis XVI died beside her, perhaps still not fully grasping why the divinely chosen monarch his ancestors had taught him to believe in had proven so powerless. But the people who watched them die understood perfectly. They understood that the system was built on lies, and that all systems built on lies eventually must fall. France's bloodshed was sudden and catastrophic, but in Russia the process would be different. In Russia, the collapse of monarchy was slower. It was also darker. Nicholas II had inherited an empire already in decay, a throne populated by men weaker than their predecessors, each one more dependent on advisors and manipulators than the last. He was not a reformer. He was not visionary. He was, by most accounts, an ordinary man forced into an impossible role. And because he was ordinary, because he lacked the brutal cunning his position required, he was devoured by those around him who understood power better. His wife Alexandra suffered the particular tragedy of being a woman desperate to matter in a world that had been designed to deny her significance. She had a son, the young Tsarevich Alexei, heir to the Russian throne, who suffered from haemophilia. The boy's blood wouldn't clot. A small cut, a bruise, could become life-threatening, and Alexandra, watching her son suffer, grasping for any remedy, any hope, became vulnerable to a man who promised he could heal what medicine could not. That man was Rasputin. We have already discussed Rasputin, the depraved mystic, the manipulator, the man who embodied everything corrupt about imperial power. But what matters here is what his presence revealed. It revealed that at the absolute heart of Russian authority, in the most intimate chambers where the fate of an empire was decided, the decision makers were not wise elders or strategic geniuses. They were a desperate woman trusting a charlatan and a weak Tsar who could or wouldn't remove the poison from his own court. The empire was being directed by their fears, by their desperation, by their willingness to believe in magic rather than face reality. When World War I consumed Russia, when millions of soldiers died in trenches and supply lines collapsed, and the economy fractured, when the cities began to starve, Nicholas was largely absent. He spent time at the front, removed from the capital, leaving Alexandra in control. And Alexandra isolated in her palace, receiving reports through channels she could verify. Making decisions on the advice of a mystical fraud, was utterly disconnected from what was actually happening in her country. The empire was crumbling. She believed it was stable. Reality and perception had diverged so completely that they no longer inhabited the same world. The revolution, when it came, didn't come for Nicholas and Alexandra specifically. It came for the system they represented. And as the Bolsheviks consolidated power, as the old order was systematically dismantled, Nicholas and his family were transported to Ekaterinburg, a city in the Urals, kept in a basement room, and here, in these final days, something extraordinary and terrible occurred. Nicholas and Alexandra, even as their empire vanished around them, even as the world they had known was being erased, still believed they would be rescued, still believed that somehow divine providence would intervene, still believed that their bloodline granted them protection that ordinary people didn't possess. On the 17th of July 1918, they were gathered in that basement. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, their household staff. They were told they were being moved. And then the execution squad entered, and bullets ended all of them. The Tsar, the Tsarina, 4 daughters, the young heir, all of it finished in minutes, an entire family eliminated, an entire bloodline erased. The revolutionary logic was brutal but clear. If bloodline could be allowed to justify power, then the bloodline itself had to be destroyed completely so that no heir could emerge to reclaim the throne. It was not a clean death. It was not quick. The family was shot and then desecrated, their bodies burned so that no relics could become symbols of restoration. The revolutionaries understood what they were doing. They were not just killing individuals, they were executing an idea. They were proving, with finality, that divine right was a fiction that bullets could penetrate as easily as flesh. Nicholas's last belief, sustained almost to the moment of his death, was that God would not permit the anointed Tsar to perish. God, it seemed, disagreed. But not all monarchies fell to revolution. Some learned from watching France and Russia burn, and they chose a different path. They chose surrender disguised as evolution. They chose survival. The British monarchy's transformation into constitutional monarchy is often presented in historical textbooks as a gradual, enlightened process, centuries of democratic values slowly tempering absolute power, culminating in a more perfect form of governance. This narrative is comforting and largely fictional. The truth is messier. British monarchs didn't gracefully accept diminishment because they suddenly believed in democracy. They accepted it because they watched what happened when they didn't. They read the pamphlets circulating after the French Revolution. They observed the Russian collapse, and they understood, with a clarity born of survival instinct, that absolute power was becoming a liability rather than an asset. So the British Crown made a calculation. It would surrender actual governing power to Parliament. It would become symbolic rather than practical. It would transform itself from a ruling authority into a cultural institution, and in doing so, it would ensure its survival. This represented something remarkable. It was the perfection of what we have explored throughout this entire documentary, the separation between who wears the crown and who actually rules. Except now, instead of being hidden behind theatre and maintained through deception, the separation became official, explicit. The monarch would be head of state in name while Parliament would be head of state in fact. Everyone would know this was the arrangement. The theatre would continue, but with the understanding that it was theatre, and yet the theatre did continue, because here was the genius of constitutional monarchy. It discovered that the pageantry was valuable in itself. The coronations, the ceremonial functions, the symbolic authority, these things attracted tourists and sold newspapers and gave people something beautiful to witness. The crown became not the instrument of absolute power, but the symbol of national identity. And symbols, it turned out, were worth money and cultural capital. Modern constitutional monarchies, particularly the British, are the ultimate expression of royal theatre. They have evolved the deceptions we've examined throughout this documentary into something almost pure. They maintain the appearance of authority while exercising almost none. They perform tradition while being utterly modern. They offer the psychological satisfaction of hierarchy and ceremony while remaining fundamentally subject to democratic will. It is, in a way, the most sophisticated version of what monarchy has always been, elaborate deception refined to an art form. And this creates a peculiar inversion. The royal scandals we see today, affairs, divorces, rebellious children, financial improprieties, are treated as entertainment precisely because they hold no real political consequences. A queen's infidelities in the time of Louis XIV could destabilize the succession and threaten the realm. A queen's infidelities in modern Britain are tabloid material. They matter to gossip, not to governance. What would have been a state crisis becomes celebrity drama. The crown's loss of power actually makes its personal failings less consequential. Is this more honest than what came before? Arguably, yes. Constitutional monarchies admit what absolute monarchies had to deny, that the person wearing the crown doesn't necessarily possess special wisdom or divine favor. The performance continues, but at least now everyone knows it is a performance. The theatre no longer claims to be reality. Or is it simply a more sophisticated form of the same deception we have explored throughout this documentary? Perhaps constitutional monarchy is merely the most evolved version of separating image from substance, theatre from truth, the public performance of authority from the private reality of powerlessness. Whatever the answer, these monarchies survived where others fell. They learned that the crown's survival depended not on defending its power, but on transforming itself into something else entirely. Something that could endure precisely because it no longer genuinely threatened anyone. And yet, for all their adaptation, for all their transformation, they could not escape one fundamental truth that our entire exploration has revealed. We have traced corruption through palaces and cathedrals, through centuries of royal deception and hidden manipulation. We have watched powerful people become isolated from reality, surrounded by those who tell them what they want to hear. We have observed how vulnerability creates opportunity for exploitation, how secrecy enables abuse, and how systems designed to concentrate power inevitably create structures that protect that power at any cost. But these are not merely historical phenomena, they are patterns. And patterns, once recognized, become visible everywhere. The thrones are gone, the monarchies have fallen or transformed or surrendered their authority, but the game remains, the same manipulations, the same deceptions, just wearing modern clothes. Consider how power operates in structures today, whether corporate or governmental or religious. A leader rises, becoming increasingly isolated by their position. The people around them, advisors, yes, men, those dependent on their continued authority, begin to filter information. They tell the leader what the leader wants to hear. They suppress bad news. They exaggerate successes. The leader, surrounded only by positive reinforcement, gradually loses connection to reality. They begin to believe their own mythology. They begin to imagine themselves exceptional, exempt from normal constraints, deserving of privileges denied to others. This is not different from what occurred in royal courts. The mechanism is identical. The isolation is the same. The vulnerability to manipulation persists, and wherever there is vulnerability, there are those willing to exploit it. Just as courtiers once manipulated weak kings, modern advisors manipulate modern leaders. Just as mistresses once wielded power through proximity and influence, modern operatives wield power through information control and access. The specific vehicles change. The fundamental dynamic remains constant. Those who understand power better than their titular leader use that understanding to redirect authority toward themselves. The patterns we have examined throughout this documentary continue in new forms. Religious manipulation still occurs, though now it manifests in cult leaders influencing politicians, rather than mystics influencing queens. Sexual scandal still destroys leaders, though now it circulates through social media rather than underground pamphlets. Mental illness still intersects dangerously with power, though modern examples involve medication rather than hemophilia, psychology rather than mysticism. Childhood trauma and exploitation still creates vulnerable decision makers, though now we call it complicated family backgrounds rather than poisoning at court. The names change, the era changes. The fundamental vulnerability of concentrated power remains. We see this in corporate structures where CEOs become so insulated from consequences that they make catastrophic decisions based on distorted information. We see this in political systems where leaders surrounded by loyalists lose connection to the concerns of those they govern. We see this in institutions where authority is unquestioned and accountability is minimal. In each case, the pattern is recognizable to anyone who has studied royal deception. A person in power becomes increasingly disconnected from reality, increasingly vulnerable to manipulation, increasingly willing to rationalize abuse because those around them rationalize it. The secrecy enabling abuse hasn't vanished either. It has simply adapted. Where once it was hidden in palace chambers, now it hides behind corporate confidentiality agreements, behind non-disclosure settlements, behind power dynamics that silence victims. The basic structure persists. Someone in authority abuses that authority, and the systems surrounding them work to keep that abuse hidden, rather than preventing it from occurring. Perhaps most crucially, the theatre persists. The manufactured reality that separates how power presents itself from how power actually operates remains as essential now as it was in Versailles. A corporation projects an image of benevolence while internally prioritizing profit above all else. A government projects an image of transparency while conducting its actual business behind closed doors. A religious institution projects an image of moral authority while protecting abusers. The theatre continues because it works. It continues because people want to believe in benevolent authority, and power is willing to exploit that desire. Understanding these patterns matters, not because history repeats, but because human nature remains constant. The vulnerabilities we've examined across centuries of royal deception continue to shape how power operates today. But there is something we must acknowledge, something that complicates everything we've discussed throughout this documentary. The very history we have been examining was not passively preserved for us. It was actively constructed, falsified, controlled, erased. Every history is someone's story, and those in power make sure it is their story that survives. Consider what we know and what we don't know about the monarchies we've explored. We know what official court historians recorded. We know what the monarchs wanted preserved. We know the narratives that served power. But what do we not know? How many scandals were never written down, existing only in whispered conversations that died with the people who heard them? How many letters were burned to destroy evidence? How many records were rewritten to eliminate embarrassing truths? How many victims were simply never mentioned in any historical document? The diamond necklace affair survived because it was too public to suppress. But how many royal frauds occurred in shadow and were simply erased? How many illegitimate children were written out of genealogies? How many madnesses were hidden so thoroughly that they never appeared in any official record? We know about Rasputin because his influence was eventually impossible to deny, but how many other manipulators worked unseen behind the scenes, their influence never documented? And consider who was systematically excluded from history entirely. Women whose perspectives would have complicated official narratives. Servants who witnessed abuse in private chambers, colonized peoples whose exploitation supported European monarchies, but whose voices were considered unworthy of preservation. Marginalized populations who understood the corruption intimately, but whose testimony was never recorded in formats that survived. History as it was written is not history as it occurred. It is history as power wanted it remembered, yet we've learned remarkable things through unorthodox means. Private letters never intended for public eyes. Diaries written in hidden moments. Archaeological discoveries revealing truths officials denied. Scholars willing to challenge traditional narratives, often women and people from marginalized backgrounds who brought perspectives official historians had dismissed. Revisionist approaches that looked at documents we'd always had but finally asked different questions. DNA evidence that proved bloodline claims were fraudulent. These sources, these methods, these questions have gradually revealed truths that official histories concealed. This documentary exists because of that work. Every revelation we've presented comes from somewhere, from historians who questioned, from archaeologists who dug, from letter collections that survived, from modern scholarship that looked at old material with new eyes. But we should be honest about something fundamental. This documentary is itself a construction. We have selected certain stories, emphasized certain patterns, interpreted certain evidence in particular ways. Another documentarian using the same historical material might construct a different narrative. We've made choices about what matters, what deserves emphasis, what drives the larger argument. This doesn't mean we're wrong. It means we're honest about the nature of history itself. All history is interpretation. All historical narrative involves selection. There is no objective history, only more or less carefully constructed versions of the past, some closer to truth and some farther from it, depending on how rigorously we've engaged with evidence and how willing we've been to question our own assumptions. The question isn't whether history is constructed, it is. The question is whether we're willing to do the harder work of constructing it as accurately as possible, acknowledging evidence that contradicts our preferred narrative, seeking out perspectives that challenge official versions, and remaining vigilant against the ways power continues to manipulate historical understanding. Some histories are lies told deliberately. Some are truths obscured through negligence. Some are partial truths that served power. And some, if we look carefully enough, if we listen to the marginalized voices, if we remain skeptical of official narratives, can bring us closer to understanding what actually happened and why it matters. So what does it mean to understand royal deception? Why does it matter that we've traced centuries of hidden corruption, exposed manipulation, revealed the gap between authority's image and its reality? The answer is not historical curiosity. The answer is pattern recognition. The game has changed forms many times. Monarchies have fallen, been replaced by democracies, been reimagined as constitutional symbols. But human nature hasn't changed. The mechanisms of power remain fundamentally similar, and anyone willing to study them can learn to recognize them anywhere they appear. Look at a modern political system. A leader rises to prominence, surrounded by advisors and donors and operatives who wield real power, while the leader takes public credit and public blame. The leader becomes increasingly isolated, receiving information filtered through those who benefit from particular interpretations. The leader begins to believe their own narrative, to imagine themselves exceptional and above normal constraints. Meanwhile, the people supporting the leader work to maintain an image, a performance of authority and competence, while the actual decision-making happens in private. Doesn't this feel familiar? This is royal court dynamics wearing a democratic suit. Or consider celebrity culture. Individuals elevated to extraordinary status, surrounded by people dependent on their continued prominence. Their lives become performance, a carefully curated image designed to maintain audience fascination. The gap between the presented self and the private self widens. Scandals erupt when that gap becomes visible. Fans are shocked to discover that their idol isn't divine after all, just human and often deeply flawed. We've seen this movie before. We've simply displaced it from palaces to red carpets. Or examine social media, where every user becomes a miniature monarch of their own presentation. We curate our lives into narratives. We control the information we present. We create a gap between our public image and private reality. We perform versions of ourselves for audiences. We've democratized royal theatre. Everyone now understands, on some level, what Marie Antoinette discovered too late. That identity is partly construction, that reality and presentation can diverge, that people will judge us based on what they see rather than what is true. Understanding these patterns doesn't make you cynical, it makes you critical. There is a difference. Cynicism says everything is lies and nobody can be trusted. Critical thinking says that you should pay attention to where power flows, who benefits from particular narratives, what incentives shape the information you're receiving. It says that authority should be questioned not from hatred but from respect, because unchecked authority tends toward corruption, and checking that tendency protects everyone, including those in authority. The patterns we've traced suggest some practical vigilance for contemporary life. When a leader is surrounded only by loyalists, that is concerning. When information is heavily controlled or filtered, that is a warning sign. When image and reality diverge significantly, question why. When marginalized voices are systematically excluded, listen to what they're saying anyway. When power claims to be transparent while maintaining secrets, remain skeptical. When you feel irrationally attached to the image of a person in authority, examine why that attachment exists. None of this requires conspiracy thinking or paranoia. It simply requires the willingness to see that human beings in positions of power face the same temptations as monarchs did, that the structures surrounding power tend to enable corruption, and that visibility and accountability matter tremendously. Knowledge about how deception operates doesn't paralyze you, it empowers you. It makes you harder to manipulate, more capable of recognizing when you're being deceived, better equipped to resist when power attempts to exploit you. It transforms you from passive consumer of authority into active critical thinker about power dynamics. This is why the patterns matter. This is why studying royal deception remains urgently relevant. The monarchies fell. The thrones were dismantled or stripped of actual authority. Revolutions erupted, promising to overturn the old order and create systems based on merit rather than birth. Democratization spread across the world. Supposedly, the age of inherited power was ending, and yet, the families we've been discussing throughout this documentary still exist, many of them not ruling from palaces anymore, but still wealthy, still influential, still connected to power structures in ways that matter tremendously. What happened was not the elimination of aristocratic power, but its transformation. The mechanism changed. The fundamental advantage persisted. Consider what occurred when monarchical authority became obsolete. The aristocratic families who had once controlled monarchs, who had wielded power through proximity to thrones, who had accumulated vast landholdings and resources over centuries, faced a choice. They could fight to preserve the old system, or they could adapt to the new one. Most chose adaptation. The duke became a railroad magnate. The count became an industrial capitalist. The noble family became a banking dynasty. The specific vehicles of power changed, but the people wielding power remained largely the same. In colonial systems particularly, this transformation was stark. European nobility who had served as administrators in colonized territories found themselves positioned to become the post-colonial business elite. They understood the territory, had existing networks, possessed capital accumulated through colonial extraction. When independence movements succeeded and colonial governments withdrew, these families simply pivoted. They became the new aristocracy, the economic elite of the newly independent nations, maintaining power through private wealth rather than official authority. Religious institutions followed a similar arc. The Catholic Church, which had wielded enormous temporal power alongside spiritual authority, couldn't maintain that temporal power in modern secular states. But it could maintain influence through control of educational institutions, charitable networks, and spiritual legitimacy. By transforming from political actor to educational and charitable institution, the Church preserved its wealth, its networks, and its influence, just channeled through different mechanisms. What made this transformation so seamless was something fundamental. These families possessed inherited wealth. They possessed social networks spanning centuries. They possessed name recognition and cultural prestige. When supposedly meritocratic modern systems emerged, supposedly offering opportunity based on talent rather than birth, these families had unimaginable advantages. A family name that opened doors. Capital to invest in education, connections, opportunities, networks of family and former allies in every significant institution. In systems supposedly based on merit, inherited privilege became nearly invisible because it operated through the appearance of individual achievement. A revolutionary nation proclaimed that titles meant nothing, that all citizens were equal. And technically they were, legally they were, but when the Duke's descendants owned a significant percentage of the nation's land, when his great-grandchild had connections to every powerful businessman in the country, when his name alone commanded respect and opened doors, was equality truly achieved? The structures had changed, but the outcome hadn't. Power remained concentrated in the same families, just legitimated differently. The Duke's palace might have become a luxury hotel, a museum, or a cultural centre. His descendants might have abandoned noble titles, but they still owned the property, they still accumulated wealth, they still maintained influence. Revolution promised to overturn the old order, but the old order was too entrenched. It simply learned to look modern. It rebranded itself as meritocratic achievement, as business success, as entrepreneurial vision, while being fundamentally sustained by inherited advantages most people never saw. This is where old power went, not away. Transformed, not eliminated, adapted. The aristocracy didn't disappear, it became the oligarchy. But there is something even more significant than the persistence of aristocratic families into the modern age. What persisted was far more dangerous. The techniques themselves. The scripts that worked centuries ago didn't disappear. They evolved, they adapted, and they continue to work because human psychology hasn't changed. Different costumes, different stages, but the same script, the same actors, the same victims. Consider religious manipulation. Rasputin wielded power through mysticism, through claims of spiritual authority that the desperate believed because they wanted to believe. He created dependence through manufactured hope. In the modern world, this same dynamic continues through different vehicles. Cult leaders use identical techniques, creating isolation, offering special knowledge, demanding absolute obedience, exploiting vulnerability. Spiritual gurus accumulate fortunes and devoted followers through the same mechanisms Rasputin employed. The theology changes, the era changes, the psychology remains constant. Vulnerability to manipulation hasn't evolved in 400 years, or examine information control. The royal court controlled what information reached the monarch. Court historians wrote the narratives. Letters were intercepted. Reality was filtered through those who benefited from particular interpretations. In the modern age, this mechanism hasn't vanished. It has been industrialized. Media conglomerates filter information. Algorithms determine what billions of people see. Lobbyists and PR firms control narratives in ways the Sun King could never have imagined. The monarchy's control over information was crude compared to contemporary media manipulation. But the essential dynamic persists. Information is controlled by those with power. Reality is shaped by those who own the channels. The public receives filtered narratives rather than unmediated truth. The spectacle of monarchy, the coronations, the pageantry, the visual performance of authority, continues in modern political theatre and celebrity culture. A presidential campaign is a coronation by other means. The performance of leadership mimics the performance of royalty. We elect people partly based on their ability to perform authority convincingly, just as monarchies once depended on the ability to perform divinity convincingly. The substance may differ, but the theatrical mechanics remain. Celebrity culture is monarchy without the legitimizing claim of divine right. Celebrities are chosen simply for their ability to captivate attention, to perform compelling versions of themselves. The mechanism of manufactured hierarchy, of people elevated beyond normal human status through spectacle, carries forward from palaces to red carpets unchanged. The manufactured dependence that monarchs created also persists, merely reorganized. A medieval peasant was bound to his lord through legal systems the peasant couldn't escape. A modern worker is bound through systems of debt, through healthcare tied to employment, through the structure of capitalism that requires most people to sell their labor to survive. The specific chains change. The fundamental dynamic of making people dependent on those with power endures, and the hidden advisors remain. The king's counselors became the merchant princes behind democratic leaders. Rasputin's mystique became the consultant's expertise. The mistress who whispered in the king's ear became the lobbyist meeting behind closed doors whose name the public never learns. For every visible political leader, there are dozens of figures wielding real power from positions the average citizen doesn't know exist. Even the exploitation of children continues in new forms. Where once child monarchs were groomed and controlled for political advantage, now child influencers are groomed and controlled for economic advantage. The mechanics of exploitation remain, taking vulnerable young people, surrounding them with adults whose interests they serve, marketing them to audiences, extracting value while claiming to provide opportunity. The costume has changed from royal robes to social media fame. The vulnerability, the exploitation, the systematic extraction of value, these persist. We can trace every major manipulation technique used in historical courts and find its contemporary equivalent. Not because history repeats, but because the human vulnerabilities that enable manipulation haven't evolved. And yet there is something genuinely new occurring. For the first time in history, the techniques that created royal deception have been democratized. Everyone now possesses the tools to create their own royal theater. A teenager curates an Instagram feed presenting a carefully constructed version of their life, the highlights, the achievements, the moments designed to impress. They've become their own monarch, performing authority over their own curated reality. A politician films a campaign video that shapes his presentation into what voters want to see, controlling his image through professional theatre. A corporation maintains a public relations machine designed to manage perception while its actual practices remain hidden. An influencer creates a parasocial relationship with millions of followers who believe they know this person intimately, though they see only a carefully constructed performance. We've all become architects of our own deceptions, creating gaps between our presented selves and our actual selves, performing versions of ourselves for audiences. But something else has happened simultaneously. Information that was once locked in palace archives is now available to anyone with internet access. Documents that governments and corporations tried to suppress exist in public databases. Voices that official histories silenced can now speak directly to millions. The documentary itself is evidence of this shift. Research that would have required traveling to dozens of libraries and archives, interviewing historians across continents, and months of specialist knowledge now sits compressed into a narrative you can watch from your home. Hidden truths have become, in principle, more accessible. And yet, access to truth and actual understanding have diverged dramatically. We've never had more information available, and we've never found it harder to determine what is true. Information abundance creates its own problems. Lies spread faster than corrections. Deepfakes make visual evidence unreliable. Coordinated disinformation campaigns exploit social media algorithms designed to amplify emotional engagement. We live simultaneously in the most transparent era and the most deceptive era. The architecture of modern communication technology enables both unprecedented truth-telling and unprecedented manipulation. consider the paradox. Whistleblowers can expose classified information to the world in seconds. Activists can organize movements despite government opposition. Citizens can document abuses that official authorities deny progress. But simultaneously, hostile actors can manufacture false narratives with industrial sophistication. Dictatorships can create convincing propaganda. Foreign powers can interfere in elections through disinformation. Authoritarian regimes have learned that controlling information is less effective than flooding information channels with so much noise that truth becomes impossible to identify. Regression. We exist in this contradiction. The same tools that enable exposure enable obfuscation. The same platforms that amplify truth amplify lies. The same technology that created unprecedented access creates unprecedented confusion about what to believe. Yet this is precisely why understanding royal deception matters now. The critical thinking required to see through historical manipulation is identical to the critical thinking required to navigate modern information. Ask who benefits from this narrative. What motivations shape this presentation? Who is excluded from this story? Where does the power flow? What incentives drive these claims? Who controls this channel? These are the questions that expose royal deception across centuries. These are also the questions that help navigate contemporary information landscapes. You've learned to see royal theatre. You understand how isolation creates vulnerability. You recognize how information control shapes perception. You know that official narratives often hide contradictory realities. You can spot manipulation because you've studied centuries of it. These aren't historical curiosities, they're practical tools. From golden throne rooms to smartphone screens, from divine right to viral fame, the story of hidden power continues. But now you know how to read it. We began with a question: who really ruled behind closed doors? What we've discovered across centuries and continents is that the answer is almost never the person wearing the crown. Consider the pattern. Louis XIV, the Sun King, supposedly the ultimate embodiment of absolute power, was actually constrained by courtiers who understood him better than he understood himself. They told him what he wanted to hear. They directed his attention towards certain favorites and away from others. The king, surrounded by mirrors reflecting his own magnificence, gradually became disconnected from actual governance. He believed himself supreme while lesser minds wielded practical authority. And the moment he died, the system that had truly ruled in his name simply transferred that power to the next monarch's court. The crown changed heads. Power remained with those who understood how to navigate the invisible networks. Catherine the Great commanded an empire, yet trusted advisors shaped her decisions. She was surrounded by people with their own agendas, their own motivations, their own understanding of what served power best. Her strength came not from inherent supremacy, but from her willingness to listen to those who counseled her wisely, and from her ability to eliminate those who counseled poorly. She was an exceptional monarch precisely because she understood that real power required leveraging the expertise and networks of those around her. Nicholas and Alexandra demonstrate the opposite extreme. Without the ability to effectively manage their advisors, without the political acumen to navigate competing interests, they became puppets. Alexandra's desperation over her son's hemophilia made her vulnerable. Rasputin, understanding that vulnerability, exploited it. And through that exploitation, a depraved mystic wielded more influence over Russia's fate than either the Tsar or Tsarina. The crown was worn by Nicholas and Alexandra, but their decisions were driven by information they received, through channels they didn't fully control, by advisors with their own interests, by dependencies they didn't fully acknowledge. What unified these monarchs across centuries, across continents, across wildly different circumstances, was their isolation. Each sat at the apex of power, theoretically absolute, yet practically dependent on networks of people they couldn't fully trust and couldn't fully escape. Each received information filtered through intermediaries. Each made decisions based on partial truths and strategic omissions. Each believed themselves supreme while being manipulated by those close enough to influence their perception. The courtier who whispered in the ear, the mistress in the bedchamber, the religious advisor claiming divine guidance, the chancellor controlling access, the servant delivering messages. These figures weren't peripheral to power, they were power's actual infrastructure. The crown was theatre. The real governance happened in smaller rooms, in private conversations, in the networks that connected those who understood how institutions actually functioned. And this pattern repeated. Renaissance Italy and medieval France, Imperial China and Ottoman Constantinople, wherever power was concentrated in a single person or small group, the same dynamic emerged. Real authority dispersed into networks, information became currency, access became power. The visible authority became a tool used by invisible authorities. The monarch became at once supreme and profoundly constrained. But perhaps most crucially, we've seen how this dynamic didn't simply disappear when monarchies fell, it transformed. The king became the president, the emperor became the CEO, the court became the cabinet or the board. The crown was removed, but the fundamental structure of concentrated power inviting manipulation persisted. Democratic systems reduced the monarchy's authority, but didn't eliminate the underlying dynamic, that those closest to power wield disproportionate influence, that information control shapes decision-making, that institutions develop their own logic separate from the individuals nominally leading them. We asked who really ruled, and we found the answer layered and complex. It wasn't one person. It was never simply the person in the crown. It was networks. It was those who understood the actual mechanics of power rather than its formal structure. It was advisors and courtiers and lovers and priests and family members and bureaucrats. People with their own motivations, their own vulnerabilities, their own ways of converting proximity to authority into practical influence. This isn't cynicism, it is clarity. Power, we discovered, works differently than how it presents itself. The gap between the performance and the reality isn't incidental, it is essential. All systems that concentrate power in a small group create this gap. All such systems invite the manipulations we've witnessed across centuries. And all such systems eventually face the reckoning that France and Russia faced, when the gap between what the people are told and what is actually true becomes too large to maintain. But beyond these historical facts and royal scandals, beyond the specific names and dates we've explored, lie deeper truths about ourselves and the world we've built. But there is something more uncomfortable we must consider. These revelations about royal deception captivate us for reasons we should examine carefully. We judge these historical figures harshly. We marvel at their manipulation, their willingness to deceive, their disconnect from realities. We feel satisfaction seeing them exposed, seeing their deceptions unraveled, seeing the gap between their image and their truth revealed. But why? What does our hunger for these revelations say about us? Part of it is schadenfreude, the pleasure in seeing powerful people revealed as frauds. There is satisfaction in discovering that the person elevated to godlike status was actually vain or gullible or manipulated. It levels a playing field that always felt fundamentally unfair. We judge the king's corruption and feel momentarily equal to him. Part of it is validation. Many of us have suspected that authority isn't what it claims to be, that those in power aren't wiser or more inherently deserving than anyone else. The documentary confirms what we suspected. It vindicates our skepticism, but there is also something darker. There is a thrill in uncovering secrets, in knowing things the masses don't know, in being privy to hidden truths. We enjoy feeling like insiders with special knowledge. This very documentary could be, from a certain perspective, feeding that appetite, giving you secret knowledge about power that makes you feel sophisticated and aware. That is not necessarily bad, but it is worth noticing. Yet beyond these comfortable responses lies something more challenging. We judge these historical deceivers, but how different are we, really, in our curated lives and performed identities? Consider what we've learned. Monarchs created false images, controlled information, performed versions of themselves designed to influence perception. They lived in gaps between their public performance and private reality. They maintained illusions that served their interests. And we do exactly the same thing. The Instagram feed you curate, highlighting achievements and moments while erasing struggles and mundanity. This is the same mechanism. The professional persona you maintain at work, different from who you are in private. Same mechanism. The way you present yourself on social media, carefully choosing what to reveal and what to hide. This is royal theatre in miniature. We're all monarchs now, with smaller kingdoms. We all practice deception on some level. We all maintain gaps between appearance and reality. We judge historical figures for doing precisely what we do constantly in our own lives. This doesn't mean deception is inevitable evil. There is legitimate value in some performances. A leader needs to project confidence even when uncertain. A worker needs professional boundaries. A person maintains privacy partly through selective presentation. Some amount of performance isn't dishonesty. It is social adaptation. We need it to function in complex societies. The question isn't whether performance is acceptable, but when it becomes manipulation, when it crosses from necessary adaptation into harmful deception. Here lies a genuine paradox. Complete transparency would be impossible and, in many ways, destructive. A leader paralyzed by the need to share every doubt or fear would be ineffective. A person sharing every private thought would be psychologically vulnerable. Some agreed upon fictions are necessary for civilization to function. We need to believe, to some degree, in the institutions and people we depend upon. Complete skepticism about everything would make society collapse. Yet we also need accountability. We need mechanisms to expose when leaders move from appropriate performance into damaging deception. We need to be able to question authority without destroying it. We need enough transparency to know whether our leaders are actually serving our interests or just their own. We need room for both trust and skepticism. What the documentary reveals is that this balance is fragile. Monarchies fell when the gap between performance and reality became too large, when the theatre was so obviously theatre that nobody believed in it anymore. But we also can't function in pure, unfiltered truth. That is equally unsustainable. The challenge is finding the middle ground. Healthy skepticism without cynical distrust. Critical engagement with authority without refusal to ever accept authority. An understanding that performance is part of all power while vigilance against when that performance becomes predatory. The monarchs we've studied believed their own mythology. They stopped distinguishing between performance and truth, and that disconnect from reality is what destroyed them. Our task is to maintain awareness of the gap between performance and reality without becoming either naive about it or fatalistic about it. We need to see the theatre without refusing to participate in necessary social institutions. Understanding our own relationship to truth and power is the first step toward navigating these waters wisely. But what do we do with this knowledge? We return now to where we began, an empty throne room, the gold catching light, the mirrors reflecting emptiness back at themselves. Versailles, or the Kremlin, or the palaces of Constantinople, it matters less which specific throne than what the throne represents. We see it now differently than we did at the documentary's opening. We understand what we're looking at. The camera pulls back, away from the ornate seat of power, into the shadows behind the throne, the narrow corridors where courtiers moved unseen, the private chambers where real decisions were made, the hidden doors where favored lovers entered, the staircases leading down to servants' quarters where information flowed like currency, the spaces where power actually resided, out of sight from anyone viewing the throne from the public galleries. This is what we've been examining. Not the throne itself, but everything around it. Not the crown, but the invisible network holding it in place. The documentary ends here, but the story doesn't end. It continues. It continues in the corridors of power today, in corporate boardrooms and political capitals, and the platforms where invisible hands shape what billions of people see. The thrones are empty now, but somewhere in shadows you haven't learned to see yet, the real power is being wielded. What should you take from everything we've explored? First, a healthy skepticism toward authority. Not cynical distrust of all institutions, but willingness to question what you're told. When someone claims special wisdom or inherent superiority, ask why. When power tells you something is true, consider who benefits from you believing it. This isn't paranoia. It is literacy. It is learning to read power the way you read language. Second, appreciate historical complexity. The monarchs we've examined weren't cartoon villains. They were people navigating impossible systems, often doing their best within constraints they didn't choose. Understanding this doesn't excuse their failures, it clarifies them. It shows us that systems, not just individuals, create corruption. This perspective makes you wiser about contemporary leaders too. Third, remember that every narrative serves someone, this documentary included. We've selected certain stories, emphasized particular patterns, interpreted evidence in ways that served our thesis. We tried to do this honestly and rigorously, but we were still constructing a narrative, not simply revealing objective truth. Apply this understanding everywhere. Every news story, every official statement, every documentary, all narratives ask, who constructed this? What is their interest? What perspective is missing? What would someone with a different interest tell a different story? Fourth, recognize that the gap between image and reality isn't incidental. It is fundamental to how power operates. This doesn't mean image is always deceptive, but it means understanding that how power presents itself is different from how it actually functions. This applies to politicians and corporations, celebrities and family dynamics, institutions and individuals. The performance and the reality coexist. Your task is learning to see both. Fifth, understand patterns of manipulation wherever they appear. You've studied centuries of it now. You've seen how isolation creates vulnerability, how information control shapes perception, how dependency enables exploitation, how theater maintains power. You've learned these patterns in historical contexts, which makes them visible in contemporary ones. When you see these patterns in your own life, in institutions you belong to, relationships you maintain, systems you participate in, you'll recognize them, and recognition is the first step toward resistance. None of this makes you cynical. It makes you capable. It transforms you from passive consumer of narratives into active critical thinker. It empowers you to navigate a world where power is rarely what it appears to be. It gives you tools to see through manipulation without becoming so skeptical that you can't function in society. The documentary ends here. The camera finally pulls back from the empty throne room. The lights fade, the mirrors go dark, but you carry something with you now. You carry questions, you carry frameworks for understanding, you carry the awareness that power operates differently than how it presents itself, and you have tools to read those differences. You know now where to look, you know what questions to ask. You know how to read the shadows. The rest is up to you.